disagreements in John and the other Gospels, and a PS from Plotinus. It is always different to shift our imagination into another era when tarmac roads and cars were unknown. But I'm going to ask you to consider a world which was experienced by people at the time of Christ, which belies much of our carol singing at Christmas. Firstly, this world was serviced by slaves, sometimes of great status, but many utterly miserable. Secondly, each city was dedicated to a god to whom daily sacrifice of animals was required. The god that each city had in common, beside their own, see Acts 19:23, was Caesar. Worship was compulsory, except for the Jews. Herod the Great had negotiated a deal which allowed that the Jews were licensed atheists at a time when Octavius, later Caesar Augustus, had needed his support against Mark Antony in the Civil War. As the magistrate was usually the high priest of the city's god, his hands would be often dripping with blood, and the stink of animal corpses would set incense at a high price. Of course, the butchers bought the meat from the sacrifices. The educated classes would be Greek-speaking and would treat the classical poets, philosophers, and playwrights much as we treat the Bible. Most were cynical about the gods, but would not risk social exclusion by making a fuss about their beliefs. The Jews had a collection of writings which they felt was sacred enough to duplicate in every synagogue wealthy enough to possess them. They had been translated a couple of centuries before into Greek, known as the Septuagint, which enabled congregations outside Palestine to read them. Into this world, in 20 BC, was born a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria known as Philo. Bear in mind that Jesus' birth is only known to be in a bracket of 12 years. But the stated aim of Philo was to reconcile Hebrew writings with Greek philosophy. We know that he was part of a delegation to the Emperor Caligula in 40 AD, coincidentally at the same time as the dating of Mark chapter 13. His teaching encompassed the whole life of Jesus. Thus, we can at least suspect that Jesus may have been influenced by his opinions. I find tremendous inspiration in the thought that the creator of the universe was humble enough to be taught by a philosopher of his time, and by men and women not greatly different from ourselves. Apart from being a Jew, Philo was a Stoic. We can at least suspect that if Jesus agreed with Philo's arguments, he might have been called an Alexandrian, hence possibly the absurd quotation from Hosea, "Out of Egypt have I called my son," even perhaps the staying in the temple while his parents sought him. For myself, I should admit that the whole story of the wise men and the flight to Egypt seems an imaginative invention. Heavenly bodies do not guide to stable doors without catastrophic consequences. Philo has recently struck me as an interesting context for much of New Testament teaching, but what seems to me to be a much larger issue is the disagreement between John and the other three Gospels about the origin of the Eucharist, or agape. John does not mention the bread and wine at the Last Supper, except to say that his betrayer will share it with him. He places the institution squarely in chapter 6, verse 32, et sec., and goes on to say in verse 66 that many of his disciples turned back. This disagreement seems to me to be large enough for serious discussion. But then John Fletcher gave me a book by Paul Bradshaw called Eucharistic Origins. The book indicates that there were several interpretations of the Eucharist or agape, and they are evident to readers of the books of the New Testament. Acts 15, verse 37, Acts 18, verse 34, et sec., Acts 10, 19, et sec. Contrast Galatians 2, verse 11. Galatians, by the way, are akin to the Welsh people, being known as Gauls by the Romans. We should turn to Plotinus. He thought that he was a follower of Plato, but had he been able to attend Oxford University in the 1900s, he would have discovered that he was a Neoplatonist. Alas, he lived from 205 to 270 AD and accompanied the Emperor Gordian on his disastrous expedition to conquer Persia. He was lucky to escape the disastrous surrender and survived to write the Enneads. He states that the One is the first principle of all. It can only be described by what it is not. His writings are long and complex, and it is best to look on the web to see how much will interest you. I mention Plotinus because his teachings closely mirror much that is said in John's Gospel. The following quotation from his 7th tractate gives a splendid comment on many church congregations of all time. When perhaps we make the effort to clarify our ideas and close into the heart of the matter, we are at once unsettled. Our doubts throw us back on ancient explanations. If only we can counter a question with a direct answer, we are glad to be absolved from further inquiry. I am also indebted to the late Norman Skitt for giving me a book by Peter Marshall called Heretics and Believers, which points out the influence of Dean Collett of St. Paul's, who founded the public school which bears that name. When he discovered the teachings of Plotinus during his sojourn in Italy, he became a leading figure in the Reformation, though denying his patronage to Tyndale. It should be said that Plotinus was not a Christian, but his thought had much influence on the arguments which were to shake the church in the 4th and 5th centuries. If you wish to know more, there is a good Penguin book called The Enneads by John Dillon. We know much about the Bible, which is arcane and shrouded in the fog of history. But we do know much that we allow to be taught, which we know to be untrue. I mentioned before the wise men and the flight into Egypt in St. Matthew's Gospel. Of course, nobody minds these as children's stories and a good excuse for singing. I should also have mentioned the ascription of 2 epistles to St. Peter and the emphasis on the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. It is not often pointed out that both genealogies end with Joseph, and it is very unlikely that a king, not famed for sexual restraint, living in 900 BC, would not have had a bloodline to most of the Jewish people. John 17, verse 17, prays that the followers of Christ will be sanctified by truth. The most disastrous betrayal of Christianity is that the Church should allow itself to avoid or to belie the truth when it is known. I'm very grateful for your indulgence in listening to my ideas and opinions, and I do hope that it will become a regular practice to discuss church teaching in a friendly and tolerant manner. We are blessed with much talent here in Monmouth, both clergy and laity. Next month, on the 1st of October, I shall be addressing the foul doctrine of original sin. Incidentally, I don't think it's a foul doctrine at all, but someone quoted it to me. And then I shall finally retire from pestering people.